China pledges $3 billion to help developing countries recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. We'll bring you the latest from the Global Health Summit. And U.S. President Biden welcomes Republic of Korea President Moon Jae-in at the White House. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. President Moon Jae-in of the Republic of Korea met with U.S. President Joe Biden on Friday. The two leaders met to discuss a wide array of issues, including vaccine cooperation, climate change, and security on the Korean Peninsula. CGTN's Nathan King joins us now, live from the White House. And Nathan, the two leaders met. They held talks for a long time. They came out, they held a joint news briefing. Of course, the big issue is the nuclear issue on the Korean Peninsula. Efforts to resolve that in the past have proved elusive. So what did they say this time?
Well, they said a lot, but it's often what's not said in these press conferences, isn't it? What's interesting is that these meetings went on far longer than expected. And when they came out, we'll play you a clip in a minute, essentially they seemed sort of in lockstep, but it was very diplomatic language. And we know that from Seoul's point of view, even though they were very worried about the Trump administration, remember the first year or so was fire and fury, will rain rockets down on you, DPRK, to we're in love, and the oversized envelopes of letters between Kim Jong-un and President Trump, there was a window of opportunity there. And let's face it, Moon Jae-in is seeking and has been successful on the sort of Sunshine Policy 2.0, where there would be perhaps a relaxation of some sanctions against Pyongyang in return for some sort of offering of denuclearization or a commitment to talks. Now, that is not where the Biden administration is. Whatever they call this policy, I don't think they have a label for it. It's basically strategic patience, which is code for containment until Pyongyang makes an effort. However, both of them, after what Moon called frank talks, which is diplomatic speak for disagreement often, they did their best to sing from the same hymn sheet, as we'd say in the UK.
We spoke about the shared approach of the shared approach to the Democratic People's Republic in Korea and continuing threat of the DPRK's nuclear and missile programs. And we both are deeply concerned about the situation. Our two nations also share a willingness to engage diplomatically with the DPRK, to take pragmatic steps that will reduce tensions as we move toward our ultimate goal of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Today, I affirm to President Moon that the United States will proceed in close consultation with the Republic of Korea in our strategy and our approach.
Recently, the Biden administration concluded its DPRK policy review, building on past agreements, including the Singapore Joint Statement, while taking a calibrated and practical approach to seeking diplomacy with North Korea, is indeed a welcome direction of the Biden administration's North Korea policy.
One thing that Seoul had been puzzled about is why, after an extensive review of DPRK policy from the White House, they hadn't announced a special envoy. Well, they have now, Sung Kim, and many people who watch Peninsular relations will know that he has some deep expertise in the peninsula and was part of the Obama team. And this seems to be a little bit of a pattern here when it comes to DPRK, essentially throwing out every effort that the Trump administration made, no matter how chaotic, to engage with Pyongyang into a sort of strategic patience containment strategy where Pyongyang has to go first. This is not in lockstep with Seoul's current policy.
Nathan, looking a little bit more broadly at this White House foreign policy, since taking office in January, it seems President Biden's overriding foreign policy concern is reaching out to American allies in the region, that's Southeast Asia, to build an anti-China alliance. He's held a White House meeting with Japan's Prime Minister, now the meeting with the South Korean leader. Officials have also talked with the so-called Quad members, India and Australia. Is that what this is all about, building an alliance against China?
Well, it's funny, this meeting happened the day after signing a ceasefire in, of course, the Middle East between Hamas and Israel. And this administration really don't want to be in the Middle East. They know the future of the 21st century is in Asia. And you're right, it was Prime Minister Suga, of course, who came here first. And then it's Moon, the president of the Republic of Korea. They want to focus on Asia. However, remember, the policy of the Biden administration is strength at home means competing with China abroad, but build up alliances. But the problem is, even though the Trump administration sort of said America first, you can do a lot when you do it on your own. But when you start bringing in allies, you have to take in their concerns. And anyone who studies Tokyo and Seoul relations knows they are diametrically opposed on a lot of things, and relations haven't been good. This is going to be the problem with the Biden administration if they try and basically put a square peg through a round hole. That means allies in East Asia in some sort of containment strategy over China. What was so interesting to me today was the lack of the word China in every utterance. We know that behind the scenes, the National Security Council, the White House have been pushing Seoul to make some sort of declaration. They talked about democratic values and international order, but Moon did not take the bait like Suga did on mentioning Taiwan, for example. We have heard talks about supply chains when it comes to semiconductors, but no commitments yet. And let's face it, South Korea is a really key part of all that. There's talk of COVID. Now, there was one big announcement that the US would supply COVID vaccines to the troops of ROK, but not the soldiers, not citizens. That might be a little bit patronizing and actually revealing where actually the US lens is when it comes to the peninsula. So I don't know whether these warm words are going to wash when the journalists write their copy in Seoul tonight. Let's see. It's very, very different. And the Quad was not mentioned at all. And remember, there had been this idea of bringing in Seoul to the Quad, not quite, well, it's five-sided Pentagon, right? That's not a good name. But the fact that Seoul is sort of resisting this is very interesting. Let's face it, Seoul represents a lot of what the rest of East Asia and Southeast Asia feels. They don't want to choose between the US and China. And I think behind the scenes today, President Moon made that very, very clear.
Thanks, Nathan. That's CGTN's White House correspondent Nathan King reporting there. Well, for more now on President Moon Jae-in's visit and the Global Health Summit, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Beijing is Shindo Xu. He's a political analyst and host of CGTN's Dialogue Weekend. Also with us from Cambridge, Massachusetts, is Jim Walsh. He's a senior research associate with the Security Studies program at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. From Washington, D.C., Brian Becker is the executive director of the Answer Coalition, and Jenny Town is a senior fellow and director of the 38 North program at the Stimson Center here in Washington, D.C. Thanks, everyone, for being with us. And Jenny, let me start with you. The meetings have taken place. The Korean Peninsula, and especially the DPRK's nuclear program, is of course a foreign policy priority for the United States. We've heard that a review has been conducted by this administration. What do you think is new that President Biden could bring to this?
Well, that's a good question. And I think there are still a lot of questions of what the U.S. policy really is. They've given some broad principles. But it still lacks a lot of detail. And I think the biggest question in all of this is how proactive that this policy is going to be in trying to get the North Koreans back to the table. So while they might have more flexibility when it comes to what the actual offer is and how they might proceed with the negotiations themselves, the big key is getting the negotiations jump-started again. And I think this was actually a pretty big win for Moon Jae-in at this summit. The fact that they did name a special representative for North Korea policy as a part of the summit, because the administration, the Biden administration, had previously said they weren't going to do this. And which did cause a lot of concern that the U.S. Policy was going to be very passive in actually trying to engage the North Koreans. So I think there's still a lot here to look at and a lot to work with. What Sung Kim's role will be, how active will he be? It does seem that there was a lot of pressure from the South Korean side to really fill that role sooner rather than later. So I think there's probably some things that are in the works that we probably haven't heard yet in public.
Jenny, as far as President Moon is concerned, he wants to fulfill a campaign promise to restore inter-Korean dialogue as well as, talk about security on the peninsula. How far have those efforts gone?
Well, they were very optimistic, of course, at the beginning of the process. And I think one of the biggest problems was that most of Moon's commitments really required international cooperation in order to succeed. And unfortunately, a lot of that was out of his hands, and he didn't get the cooperation that he needed to really be able to move forward on the inter-Korean agenda in a credible way, and things fell apart. In order to get those back on track, the US DPRK negotiations have to also get back on track. And I think, again, there has been a big push from the Moon administration to the Biden administration to be proactive, to get in front of this and to create some space for the South Koreans as well to get back into the game. Because obviously Moon has very limited time left, both for his own personal political legacy, but also for the success of his party moving into the next election cycle in South Korea.
Brian Becker, the former president, Donald Trump, he met with the DPRK leader Kim Jong-un with the goal of denuclearizing the Korean peninsula. Nothing much came of that, of course, but do you think there could be progress under President Biden? And we have to remember that President Biden is one of those American leaders who believes in the doctrine of regime change.
Right. I mean, if you look at Biden's whole past, you would think, well, you'd be fairly pessimistic about something new coming out. On the other hand, the Singapore summit that was signed by Trump and Kim Jong-un in mid-June 2018, it doesn't really start with denuclearization. That only arrives at point number 3. Point number 1 is the desire to have an improvement in relations between the two countries. That really provides the framework that's acceptable to North Korea to begin not denuclearization, but certainly a cap on its nuclear weapons. And that's the big issue right now. Will the Biden administration come back and actually say to the North Koreans, we want to end the Korean War. We want to have a new relationship with the DPRK, and we want to normalize relations with the DPRK. Those are the magic words. It's not actually that confusing. The DPRK is increasing its nuclear arsenal. It's not going to give up nuclear weapons, but it is ready to talk to the United States on the basis of an improvement, maybe not full normalization of relations, but moving in that direction. Anthony Blinken suggested in a Newsweek interview prior to the 2020 election back in September that there were some elements of the Trump administration's project that were very, very good. But what happened is that by putting an ultimatum that DPRK had to fully disarm, that was a deal breaker. Now, that would suggest that perhaps Blinken or perhaps others in the State Department have more of the position of Stephen Bagoon, who was sidelined in the second summit in Hanoi when John Bolton took his place and deliberately sabotaged the agreement. But can there be progress? Yes. It's just a matter of will and desire on the part of the Biden White House.
Right. And Brian, one other point, very quickly, briefly. The DPRK conducted 2 short-range missile tests at the end of March. That were the first tests that were carried out since Joe Biden came to office. What message does that send to Washington?
Well, they're getting the attention of the Biden White House, but it was important that the Biden White House, including the Secretary of State, did not make a big deal out of it. It wasn't like alarm bells were sounded. It wasn't as if we're going back to the beginning. I think both sides recognize that the DPRK is saying, look, we're still here. We can't be ignored. We have the potential to become a destabilizing impact on that region, and we have a lot more we could do than send short-range missiles. But it was a measured action on the part of the DPRK. The DPRK is insisting, pay attention to us. From there, a lot can happen. I actually am not as pessimistic as others. I think that there could be progress. Again, who knows what's really going on in the inner chambers of the Biden White House, but it would be a tremendous development for the people in Korea.
Jim Walsh, great to have you with us on the show. What is your view on something that we talked about a moment ago, and that is the relationship with South Korea in the United States, that is, trying to build this anti-China alliance right now? We understand that there was some effort on the part of the United States to get South Korea to issue some kind of statement of concern, as it was called, against China, but the South Koreans resisted that. And we remember what happened the last time when those missiles batteries were deployed in South Korea. They faced sanctions from China. So how do you see, how do you characterize this relationship right now?
Well, I think to step back from the U.S. views of the Korean-China relationship, the first place to start is Biden is an alliance guy. He has alliances in his bones, going back to when he was chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So yes, the White House may have some preferences for something Moon might say about China, but there's a difference between what you want and what you need. And really what they need and what Biden seeks is to get the alliance back together. It frayed under Trump, and certainly, as was referenced at some point, relations between Japan and South Korea frayed. And I think it's fair to say that they are on a better track now. So Biden's about alliances, first and foremost. Yes, he would like more support around China, but he's not going to cut his ally loose over that. And they're smart enough to understand that South Korea has had a policy for years of balancing between the two and are likely to balance between the two. And at the end of the day, that big treaty where we promised to fight for each other, that's with South Korea, and I think everyone knows what the score is.
So the policy that was adopted by the Obama administration, Jim, the pivot to Asia, the rebalancing as it was talked about at that time, is that still firmly on track?
You raised this earlier, and I think I might frame it a little differently. You're absolutely right to say that the U.S. for years, wants to leave the morass of the Middle East behind and focus on the most important regions of the world, and certainly Europe is one and Asia is one for sure. But the thing that I come back to and that we should keep in mind as we discuss what the U.S., how far it's willing to go in terms of giving Moon some room to maneuver, some running room here, is that the president in his first speech on Blinken's first speech on strategy was all about how U.S. foreign policy was going to support the U.S. homeland and domestic development. Mm-hmm. And he listed his top 10 priorities, and nuclear and North Korea were not really on that list of priorities. And so the president, both Moon and Biden face a tough timeline. Moon's got a year, and he wants to make a big splash on his signature policy. And so he's going to be pushing Biden to let him have some running room here. Biden probably is okay with that. Let Moon take the chances. But his main focus is that he faces a midterm election in 2 years where he's probably going to lose the House or the Senate. And so he's focused like a laser on the domestic political scene, the economy, and COVID. And so, yes, there's interest in this, and yes, there's interest in that. And he stepped into the Middle East imbroglio, the conflict recently, but he was forced to do that. All things being equal, he would like to focus on the domestic, and the foreign policy is just not going to be as high a priority.
Shindo Shua, how will China be looking at all of this effort by the United States to get its allies behind it against China?
Well, I think China, of course, welcomed the U.S. return to Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific. If the focus is more on, say, investment and trade, prosperity, stability, instead of focusing too much on the military side, for example, more warships in the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait, building up these allies and to build a united front against China. But the concern is that if that's the reality, then you would see a dividing line in this region. And we are in the middle of basically more economic integration, CPTPP or RCEP, these regional trade agreements over there. So more trade, everybody benefits from that. And it's really about to U.S. and China, as recently Singaporean premier mentioned that, if they cannot cooperate with each other, everybody suffers and everybody will lose. I think for China and the U.S., they needed to talk to each other and really figure out their relationship, what kind of a relationship they will have. Right. And that will be a huge relief on South Korea and other countries in this region.
Jenny, very briefly, climate change also a big issue for South Korea. It's the world's 7th largest emitter of greenhouse gases. Biden is expected, or was expected, to call on South Korea to implement some kind of deep cuts in its emissions. Was there any kind of commitment there? Do you see any kind of progress?
Nothing was really announced other than, the idea that climate cooperation is one of the issues that they see as part of the new relationship going forward. And I think there was a number of different things that were sort of new to the agenda this time that really focused on actual U.S.-South Korea cooperation without letting the conversation get hijacked by China, by the U.S.-China rivalry, or even North Korea for that. And I think, again, in that sense, it was a big win for South Korea to really emphasize that the alliance is moving in a new direction. It's not just military. And I think the investment that South Korean companies brought with them was a huge help in making that case.
Brian, let's turn to the Global Health Summit. World leaders gathered to address vaccine inequality. Let's listen to Chinese President Xi Jinping.
坚持公平合理，弥合
We must uphold fairness and equity as we strive to close the immunization gap. Today, the problem of uneven vaccination has become more acute. It is imperative for us to reject vaccine nationalism and make vaccines more accessible and affordable in developing countries. Major vaccine developing and producing countries need to take up their responsibility to provide more vaccines to developing countries in urgent need.
So, Brian, we have seen the vast inequalities in the availability and the distribution of vaccines around the world. In fact, if you look at the United States, it's purchased 2.6 billion doses, which is far in excess of its needs, and 100 million doses are actually sitting in warehouses right now. What do you think are the root causes of this inequality that need to be addressed, and addressed pretty quickly?
Yeah, it's really shameful, and it's so revealing. We're now living in the era of, well, some call it vaccine nationalism. You might call it vaccine imperialism, where you have Western pharmaceutical corporations having this huge stockpile and coming as, by the way, not because of they put their nose to the wheel. They got huge amounts of government subsidies to do it, and yet their own patents, their own desire for profit or super profits takes precedence over solving an international healthcare crisis. And who pays for that healthcare crisis? It's actually working class and poor people all over the world, especially in Africa, in Latin America, in the Middle East, in parts of the world that were, the colonized and semi-colonized parts of the world. And we have to make this a top priority. And all of this can be easily solved. There needs to be government action. Yeah. The Western governments need to say, healing people, protecting people, providing security for people is our #1 priority. Nothing else can come first. And I think if the West does not do this, it'll be a moral stain on Western governments that will be, it'll be with us for a long time. And the consequences are too big.
Jim Walsh, we've got this new lexicon that's entered the COVID-19 crisis right now. We just heard some of it: vaccine nationalism, vaccine imperialism, vaccine inequality, etc. And we've often heard from the experts, no one is safe until everyone is safe. Isn't it short-sighted on the part of countries that are producing the vaccine, that actually own the vaccine right now, to deny it to countries that are in dire need of it? Or, in fact, as Brian just mentioned, lifting those patent rights and getting raw materials to countries so they could manufacture it themselves?
Well, I think Biden announced this week he was in favor of getting rid of the patent, and so there is progress there.
But he is opposed by pharma companies, isn't he?
Pardon me, I'm sorry?
There are pharmaceutical companies that oppose that.
Sure. But Biden, the U.S. government, has come out in favor of it, is what I'm saying. But I agree with the fundamental principle that we should make vaccines available to people as quickly as we can, and we need to narrow the gap between those who have it and those that don't. So I'm totally on board with that. I will say that it won't be as simple as that, as we've discovered with the vaccine rollouts. That is to say, quarantines and fighting the virus was sort of one set of public policy activities, and distributing a vaccine is a different thing with a different set of challenges. We've had a set of challenges in the U.S. vaccinating people. Right. And so I absolutely support wider distribution of the available vaccines and eliminating patents and the rest. But that will not magically solve the problem. There is still a big operational set of issues around getting everyone vaccinated. But obviously, the faster we do it, the better for everyone.
All right, Shindeshu, very briefly, please. China has supplied something like 300 million doses of its vaccine to the world. What can we expect from China in the weeks and months ahead?
Well, likely China will provide more vaccines to COVAX program. Another Chinese vaccine, I think Sinovac, is to be improved in a few days by the WHO. So if that's the case, we can see more contribution from the Chinese side to the international needs over there.
Jenny, South Korea was, of course, one of the big success stories when the pandemic first broke out. It was able to prevent the spread of the virus very quickly. But now it's struggling to get an adequate supply of vaccines. There is talk of some kind of a deal with the United States. But how did South Korea get into this kind of problem?
So they did so well in the containment of it.
Yeah.
And they were very confident in South Korean companies being able to develop a vaccine indigenously, that they didn't take the measures to procure from international sources. And I don't think they really expected other countries to be so far ahead of them, and especially the US to be so far ahead of them in vaccine development. So this has been a huge point of contention among the South Korean public, and really a point of frustration among the South Korean public to see a country like the US, who was so bad at the mitigation and the containment of it, to then spring forward ahead of South Korean companies and the South Korean developed vaccines. And so this has been, it's not that South Korea can't do it, it's just that they've been behind in the timeline because their trials have taken longer to actually develop the vaccine to a point of confidence. And so it's still coming, but in the meantime, there's great pressure from the South Korean public to move forward with the vaccinations at the pace that other countries are doing.
Jim Walsh, one other issue that I want to address very quickly before we go, and that is, this was something that was addressed by President Biden at the news conference at the White House just a short while ago, and that is the availability of computer chips. The United States Department of Commerce, we know, is planning to hold talks with semiconductor companies around the world, including Samsung of South Korea. Why is this such a big priority for the United States?
Well, two reasons, and it sort of dovetails back to what we were talking about before. Remember, the Biden foreign policy, as articulated, is a foreign policy for the middle class, whatever that actually means in practice. And part of that is the supporting jobs at home. Again, because he has a big, midterm election coming up in 2 years, right, and may lose part of the government. Okay. And so anytime that he can go to the American public, yeah, and say there'll be more investment domestically in the U.S., that's a political win. And I think there is, and we get some sense of it now in the car industry. Okay. There is some sense that there are problems in the supply chain, and obviously if it's distributed in the major markets, that reduces some of those problems.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.